Hey, good morning. Okay, so welcome to the first little video supplement to the lecture. You have a lot of materials within the learning unit. And oh, by the way, if you haven't already seen my video, I did a self-introduction in the discussion board, but I'm Dr. Yule Suzanne. And I will frequently add or supplement more material um, in terms of the lecture. And this sort of is that. So basically, the PowerPoints you have available to you, and they're great to utilize as a framework for taking notes on the chapter. But sometimes I want to highlight a few things within the overview of the chapter within the PowerPoints. And I'm not lecturing on all of the content in the chapter. In fact, I skip over a lot. There's just a few sections I want to stop and elaborate or simply mark this location in the chapter as a place for you to go spend some more time. So this is the first of those videos and for this week. So we're going to go look at chapter 1, but I hope if you have not read the preface, I want to encourage you. I hope to encourage you to read that preface because that preface is very important before chapter 1. In fact, I think it's on page 15 and 16 in the Roman numerals before chapter 1 that talks about this because he gives an overview, and in that preface he basically explains the fact that he is a critical theorist. He embraces that perspective, that point of view, and without any shame whatsoever writes the entire textbook from the critical point of view. In this chapter 1, he attempts to give you a little bit of an overview, showing that there are other perspectives to look at organizational communication. And obviously the critical perspective is one of those. So he attempts to give you a little bit of an overview in this chapter. But also in the preface, he makes the argument that his other main influence beside critical theory is the link that he's a strong advocate of organizations as communication. Not organizations just use communication to get something done, but organizations are communication. Communication is organizations, and that's a very different emphasis. So take the time to go back and read that. So with that as sort of a beginning, let's segue into an overview of the chapter. And again, if you're hoping to substitute this lecture for reading the chapter, it's not going to do it for you, I'm afraid. So obviously PowerPoints begin with the chapter objectives. Humans have often defined themselves by their different group memberships, and obviously an organization continues that fundamental concept and precept. There's a quote at the very beginning of the chapter that says, organizational control is the dynamic communication process through which organizational stakeholders struggle to maximize their stake in organizations. And a lot of that has to do with this notion of the tensions and the balance between individual goals and the organizational goals and how those work together. So moving on, you have this notion of interdependence. We have the idea of control, the notion of a dialectical process. In this early part, he brings up Charles Redding, who's oftentimes considered the father of organizational communication. This notion of interdependence is very important. Without interdependent, basically groups, organizations could not and would not exist. So make sure that you understand that. These control mechanisms, remember that the critical perspective is all about power. And what takes the form of power will change from organization to organization. Frequently it's money. Sometimes it's certain resources that an organization has, whether that's the human component or whether it's technological resources. That notion and that struggle for power is very much influenced by the element of control. And so certainly there's external control, internal control, and you see some of those listed here, and so this is a very important concept in terms of the types of different controls. So make sure that you understand the five different aspects of control. Chapter then goes into dovetail with communication and organization. And again, if you've had several comm classes, that you're going to have some concepts that are review. You have another definition of communication from an organizational point of view. All right, and then he gets a little bit theoretical. So take a cup of coffee and try to think a little bit abstractly. In this part of the chapter where he's talking about this meta-theoretical framework, he steps back and says basically, you know, life is out there and you can have a different framework, a different way of looking at things, and that influences how you interpret. And so he explains that from a very broad, abstract point of view. And a lot of it is, if you've had philosophy, epistemology is the study of how you know things. Axiology is right and wrong. Ontology is state of being. But epistemology is how do we know things. There are different frameworks, different ways that we think that influence what we know. And then he goes in, and this is the important part of chapter 5. He talks about the 5 different theories of organizational communication. And the first is functionalism. I think of Sherlock Holmes and see if he comes to mind when you read this section on that. It's one of the most fundamental. Interpretivism, which a little bit is we create our own reality. And if you know anything about social constructionism, that will dovetail in nicely, and you can put your information there in terms of how we create our own sense of reality that we then interact with based on our information. Critical theory, he gives a very broad, very general point of view of the perspective that he operates from. And again, remember that the focus is on power. There's a little bit of social constructionism in there as well. In fact, you'll find that present in a lot of theoretical frameworks. Postmodernism, I have to be very careful because I personally dislike postmodernism a great deal. Basically argues that nothing is real. There are separate realities. We create our own reality, and there's no universal truth. There's no right or no wrong. It's just very vague and very much a slippery slope. It's an interesting theoretical perspective to write from. And let's see. Sorry, my phone was ringing in there. So postmodernism is continued. Feminism. This is the last perspective of this particular chapter, and it is related to critical theory, and in some ways because it's often about power, only the focus is on gender and how they work together. Okay. So chapter 2. Now, by the way, there's a chart on page 26 of chapter 1 that summarizes a lot of what we had just talked about in terms of some of those highlights. Summarizes the 5 perspectives on some different categories and how they compare. So that chart's a nice little recap. So looking at chapter 2, here he's going to focus in specifically on the perspective that he embraces, the critical perspective. And so it's important for that reason. It's important to understand that the critical perspective focuses on control of resources. And we mentioned that, I think I mentioned that earlier in chapter 1. And so you'll see that come through in this chapter as he's discussing it. The chapter begins with a history lesson, and it actually spends a lot of time talking about where critical theory began, and that's from Karl Marx. And Karl Marx did not like capitalism. He viewed capitalism as exploitation and that it was a way of subjugating classes of people. And he also argued that capitalism could not sustain itself, that eventually it would collapse upon itself. It did not have the internal structure to last. History has proved Karl Marx wrong on that aspect. Nonetheless, it is the basis for critical theory, and so it's important that you understand where Karl Marx was coming from and what are the key tenets of his thinking and his philosophy. So it's a bit theoretical. Again, some of you will love that because you love theory, you love this type of deep abstract thinking, and some of you will find it a little bit tough to get through, but it's important to understand. It's both a cultural issue and it's both an ideological issue. Now, in terms of the critiques of Marx, there are two what we call neo-Marxist views, different schools of criticism on Marxism, and they embrace many of the tenets of Marxism, and yet, obviously, given the fact that capitalism did not implode upon himself, and many of the very negative pejorative views that Karl Marx had toward capitalism did not, history has not proved him correct on that count. And so two particular schools of thought have sought to sort of reinvent Marxism in light of modern capitalism. Those two schools of thought are the Frankfurt School and cultural studies. And so that's what this is discussed here. So a lot of the economic, rather the Frankfurt School thinking is based on economic aspects, economic theory, and it's all about money. And so they focus again on this and talk about high culture, low culture, important to understand the Frankfurt School's point of view. And here you, like I said, the elitist view, the high, low culture, so on and so forth. Cultural studies is the second neo-Marxist perspective. And they look at power, which is a common theme in critical theory and a common theme in Marxism, but their focus is on media studies. And they argue that basically media in its many different aspects and forms is a form of control to control the masses. And so they look a lot, they study symbolism, semantics, and so you'll see that in that chapter. Semiotics, they study a lot of semiotics. And lastly, the chapter focuses on this idea of communication, organizations being socially created through communicative processes, and you'll find these described in this point of view as well. And again, you can read all of this in detail to grasp it. The last point of view that I want to briefly touch bases on is organizations as sites of ethical issues. Here he incorporates how ethics intertwine, and I think that many of you will find connections in there in terms of how your own ethical issues, your own paradigms fit with different perspectives from a academic point of view. And that's pretty much where it ends. So that is a very small augmentation to chapters 1 and 2, and I expect that you will dive into it and get a great deal more out of this, and we'll enjoy the videos that are coming up in this learning unit. They're very important. Please don't skip them. There's a lot of information there. Okay, that's it. Have a terrific week. I'll see you online.